Now that the Christian church is starting to increasingly be involved directly with the affairs of government, especially in Rome and in many of the successor kingdoms of the invading peoples, we need to take a closer look at some of the key elements in the early formation of the Christian movement that is going to be carried into the Middle Ages and be vital to understanding not only social issues but also economic issues, and of course the political links between religion and state will grow increasingly powerful as we look at the Middle Ages. One of the first early church fathers we want to talk about and think about will be St. Augustine of Hippo. He is going to be one of the early church fathers who, before his death in the year 430 CE, is going to provide a structure for how people should understand their faith and how they should practice it. He himself was a pagan, a non-Christian in his early life, and then later on went through a significant conversion experience and then expressed himself through literature and was able to provide lots of information to people and a model for how they should continue to lead a virtuous life. In addition, we'll take a closer look at St. Jerome. Here he is shown working over his work on a desk. He is going to be the early church father who, as a contemporary of Augustine of Hippo, is going to put together and codify the first effective Vulgate version of the Bible. And what we mean by that is the one that's going to be the official version used by the Roman Catholic Church and all of Christianity in Western Europe until roughly the 16th century. It's going to be his work that's going to draw all the different texts of the early Christian movement into one place, into one language, and to help set up the idea that people then can go within the church back to one version and extract from it the actual information, not be looking at different translations from different time periods, but have all the translations in one place. That will be the key development that Jerome will supply. Here's the idea. In the early Christian movement, as we talked about it, there was a multiple versions of ideas and concepts. There were multiple visions of which books, which scriptures were official and unofficial. What exactly was the nature of Christ was also an issue for many people to debate. As we talked about the Nicene Creed, you may have read that the church had come to the conclusion that the Christ figure was both man and God at the same time in the same place. There were other people within the Christian movement who believed that the Christ figure was just a man, like an inspired prophet from the ancient Hebrew understanding. And there were others who saw the idea of Christ as a true God that would not pollute itself by becoming a mere human, but instead was almost as if it was a hologram or a ghost where people could see the Christ figure, but it was not really there as a human. So those three ideas were in competition. They still are in competition amongst many different Christian groups in the world today, but the Council of Nicaea tried to settle the differences in 325. One of the other things that came out of the Council of Nicaea is that they were working to figure out what exactly is the full text of scriptures that the church should use to provide structure, morality instruction, concepts of how to explain faith and theology. What are the books, what are the ones of the Christian movement that were agreed upon and could be used by everybody within the Christian movement all around the edges of the old Roman Empire wherever there were Christian communities? That had never been settled, but at Nicaea they start the process, and in the 5th century they will conclude that process in many ways by choosing which Bible books are going to stay, which ones were sort of placed in what was called an apocrypha, an appendix essentially at the end, and others that were outright rejected as not useful or outside the norm of the others. So this is going to be a very human process of choosing which books go into the Bible itself, on top of the ones they're going to inherit from the Hebrew tradition, that the Christians are increasingly going to refer to as the Old Testament, and then referring to their New Testament as the new revelations of God through the life of Jesus Christ and the books of the Bible that come after that. In that same context then, Jerome had spent his life as a scholar of Latin and of other languages. He had learned very deeply about the different intricacies of the languages, and so when it came time to have somebody who could pull all the ideas together and from the different languages into one text, Jerome was the man to do it. He had some qualms. He had some issues because he felt that there was some conflict between him being a devout Christian and him using ancient texts that were from pagan backgrounds. For example, having a deep understanding of Latin literature from the golden age of Roman literature. He felt that using sort of pagan documents somehow polluted him as a Christian, but he did come up with some concepts where he decided that it was a legitimate thing for an educated Christian to maintain much of the literature of the ancient world, but also to keep their focus on the literature of salvation for their soul through Christianity. Jerome's then going to put together what's going to be called the Vulgate version of the Bible, and that is going to be the one that will continue into the early modern period all the way up until the 16th century, when other scholars looking back at documents will start to make some changes and question some of the translation work that he had done. But nonetheless, his is going to be the standard version of the Christian Bible for Europeans for about 1,000 years. The other key character of this time period is St. Augustine of Hippo. And he is going to be the church father who, before he dies in the year 430 CE, is going to leave behind a series of writings and commentaries that are going to help structure the way in which the Christian religion will be used by the following successor states in Europe. Now, he wrote a book called Confessions. Now, early on in his life, Augustine was not a Christian. He was a professor of rhetoric, a professor of philosophy and speech and thinking in northern Italy in the late 4th century, and he had made a living that way but was feeling unfulfilled. He went through a conversion experience where he was converted over to being a devout Christian, and he was trying to struggle with the previous life he had, including siring a child by a woman who was not his wife. He's had lots of doubt. He had lots of abilities to second guess himself. But he felt that he had been called to his new religion, and he was very sincere about what he was trying to do and try to organize it. Now, in his book Confessions, he's going to offer a whole bunch of ideas that are going to be useful for other Christians who have doubt about their conversion experience. He very carefully walks them through the ideas of how he lived his life, and in many ways offers a spiritual guide for others through his own personal experience. Many people will plug back into this as a way for them to help understand their own commitment to the religion of Christianity, but also look at what he was doing in his time to see how useful it could be for themselves. But he also wrote a book which was called City of God. And what he meant by that was he did a sort of a philosophical study. And he came to the conclusion that there was a necessity for a church and a religious faith to run the religion, and that there should be a state, a secular state, a non-religious, earthly organization, a government that collected taxes, kept justice, supplied military forces to protect against outsiders. In other words, he's not saying that the religion should be the government or the government should be the religion. He's making a subtle case for separating the ideas of temporal authority, running justice systems, taxation systems, creating weights and measures in the marketplace. Whatever basic governmental need there is should be done. It should be separate from religion, but it is necessary for the improvement and the betterment of all in society, and to keep the protection of the Christian movement moving forward by providing stability. He also then advocates that there is a city of God where people should devote themselves to the idea of how they're going to pass on to the other side, how they're going to live up to the standards of their religion and move forward. So he's a very early philosopher, if we take a look at this, who is going to advocate very sincerely for a separation of church and state, if you want to think of it in those terms. As opposed to some of the earlier religious ideas we'd seen in, say, Egypt, where the concept of the pharaoh with his Ka had brought together both human and divine into one place at one time, and that there was a very difficult inability to separate what exactly was the religious and spiritual function from the law and order function of someone like the pharaoh. So his work, Augustine's work, is going to help separate the two concepts and legitimate each of them as powerful things that necessarily should be done on this earth for the human population. Now, Augustine has a couple of other things that we want to talk about. And one is he was a very strong advocate for the idea of celibacy. What he meant by celibacy is that all humans who are truly devout to their religion and truly devoted to it would go through life without any sexual encounter, that they were going to set aside their human sexuality, they were going to contain it and control it with the grace of the divine, and they were not going to partake of that rather normal course of life. That celibacy for someone was going to be a sign of spiritual authority, it could be a sign of self-control, it could be a sign of devotion, but nonetheless, his very early understanding of how powerful celibacy could be is going to influence itself later on when many of the people within monastic communities and those who devote themselves, both male and female, to strict religious observation are going to have as one of the key claims that they do surrender their human sexuality, they do practice and will be celibate for life to show, demonstrate, and reinforce their devotion. Now, that's going to be a very high test. Some people looking at this from the outside essentially would label Augustine as a sexual extremist. He's essentially saying that the only kind of useful sexuality will be between a man and a woman and only for procreation. That all other sexuality is seen as a distraction, as something that is impure and somehow undermining a goodness or evil. So his very negative view of human sexuality is going to be a very powerful message going into the Middle Ages as churchmen and churchwomen who want to devote themselves to the divine, if they go into different communities or practices within the church, have to practice celibacy. That's going to be a very difficult order as we move forward, and many different regions are going to have different interpretations of it, but it is from Augustine and the tradition he supplies that many people are going to be working and looking at this as a key element of devotion. What's also emerging here in the 4th and the 5th century is the creation of monasticism. This idea that someone could surrender everything from their normal life and go into sort of a quiet retirement and spend their lives devoted to religion. Now, in some of the early days, you might see this in some of the readings, there was a form of monasticism usually practiced by hermits, where someone would choose to be totally removed from society, oftentimes living on the edge of society, in a frontier area, in a cave, other examples of living way out on a mountainside. But the idea was that they were going to totally devote themselves in their own spiritual practices and purity to pursue their understanding of the divine. Later, many of those are going to be co-opted and taken into a larger monastic community, which will lead, especially by about the time period of the 500s, into the creation of a specific kind of monastic community that will be under the rule of Saint Benedict. And Saint Benedict of Nursia is a early proponent of the ideas that you can take and you can erase the old man and replace him in a community where he is going to be by himself, but then be part of a larger group, all dedicated to the same idea, pursuing the best of the divine. So we're going to start to have a change in monasticism. The individual, the hermit kind of monastic is going to be less and less likely to be used in the early Middle Ages, and more from the 6th century forward, St. Benedict of Nursia's idea of the Benedictine rule, he's going to create a specific rule to run monastic communities where there's going to be very close conversations about how much sleep one is supposed to have, how much work they're supposed to do, their devotion during the day, how they live their lives. It's going to provide a structured monastic community for both men and later on women too, to express themselves religiously in large groups, but usually cloistered. What we mean by cloistered is behind walls, set aside from normal society, not usually interacting on a daily basis in normal neighborhoods or normal activities in a city or a countryside. These monastic communities are going to be set aside and set apart. The last development here in this area is the growing idea of what's called Petrine supremacy. Now remember, the Christian church early on did not have strict understanding of who was in charge of what and how and why. They did start to create ideas like bishops, who are going to be usually elite men who are learned, who will be giving the laity or the people of the church, as well as the priests who are leading churches, directions and ideas, information, education on what a true Christian community is like. That structure had not been like hyper-organized, and there had been some religious ideas where they're going to start to break the church down into what are called dioceses These were the old part of the Roman Empire. This is an old administrative unit. And now, increasingly, what's going to happen is the Christians are going to take the idea of a bishop controlling a diocese, which is an old Roman idea of authority, but it's going to stick. They're going to start to mimic some of the structure of the Roman government and how they're going to run the church. The idea of Petrine supremacy is this: who's in charge of religion? In all the societies we've studied so far, there's been various priesthoods, there's been the pharaoh, there's been, they say the god Shamash offering information to Hammurabi for his code. There's been lots of different ways in which the idea of who's in charge has been placed. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, there were, of course, the prophets who were foretelling the doom if people did not follow Yahweh. Same issue now with Christianity. Who's in charge here? And what's going to increasingly happen is in the city of Rome, the bishop of Rome, who is going to say that he is the inheritor of the Petrine mantle of authority. For many Christians, if they went back into their books of the Bible, they know at the end of the life of Christ, many of his disciples had spread around over places, had gone different places. One of them was named Peter. Peter, in several different Bible verses and passages, is pointed out to as sort of the next one to lead the movement. The next one who should take the place of Christ now that Christ is gone in the Christian tradition. Peter ended up living for a while and dying in Rome, and according to tradition, his burial chamber is exactly where St. Peter's Cathedral is right now in Rome, Vatican City. That the massive Basilica of St. Peter is sitting over the tomb of St. Peter. That gives the moral authority as well as the idea of religious authority to whoever is the Bishop of Rome. This idea will be growing. It will be in many ways contravened and contradicted by other major religious leaders in Constantinople or Antioch or Jerusalem. But over time, in the West especially, the Bishop of Rome, as the successor to St. Peter, will be the key person in charge of making decisions within the Christian movement. Be sure to read carefully through your text to find all the information on this key development of Christianity topic. And then, of course, do take a look at some of the sample questions to double check your knowledge.